Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be getting into Unit 4, Lesson 3, over phylogeny. And before we can get into what phylogeny means, we have to first look a little bit more broad at what taxonomy means. Taxonomy is this field of biology that is specific to classifying organisms. And so this is all about classifying or organizing organisms together and representing them based on their similar characteristics. We can divide all of life into this most broad domain, into 3 domains, and those 3 domains are our eubacteria, which are prokaryotes. Those are single-celled organisms, what we consider to be more of our true bacteria. We have archaebacteria, which is single-celled prokaryotes, but they exist in extreme environments, and so that could be like within a volcano or something like that. And then finally, the one that we're going to focus on the most is that domain eukarya, which is eukaryotes, multicellular organisms like your plants and animals. All of those are going to fall within this domain, and that's the one we're going to focus on moving forward. On the next slide, we'll see an example, a visual of a little bit more of what this looks like, how these domains can be further divided into kingdoms and phylums, so on and so forth. But it's important for now to understand that this is an ongoing process. As we, as scientists, we gather new evidence and new information, and we learn more about these existing species and their relationships to each other, we're able to update how we classify them. And one way in which we're now able to include is called phylogeny. And phylogeny is just simply classifying organisms and species based off of evolutionary history rather than just their similar characteristics. So with phylogeny for Lesson 3, we're going to specifically be talking about how organisms are related based on evolution. And just to see how this becomes more specific as you go from kingdom down to an individual species, we have this visual. So again, we're talking about the domain eukarya. These are all multicellular organisms. And within eukaryotic organisms, we have maybe a kingdom, Animalia. And this is just referring to the animal kingdom. And you can see this covers quite a large variety. We as human beings would fall within this kingdom, Animalia. And if I wanted to make it a little more exclusive, a little more specific, I could go up to the level phylum, and a phylum is going to be just a little bit more specific, where now I would look at chordata. And chordata is just referring to organisms that have a vertebral column or a vertebrae, a spinal column. Sea stars don't, and so they wouldn't be included in that more specific level. They drop off. If I go from phylum chordata to the class of Mammalia or mammals, we lose the snake. The snake does not have the classification of mammal, and so we become, again, more specific and less inclusive. And so we continue to go up to order, to family, and then we get to these top 2 levels, the most specific levels, where we're looking at an organism's genus, which in this case it looks like is specific to camels, and then to that individual species name. And we're going to go into why species are named this way here in just a moment. But the big thing to take away here is that as we go from kingdom to an individual species, it gets more and more specific. And if 2 organisms are in, let's say, the same category in their genus, that is also saying that they would have the same family, the same order, the same class, so on and so forth. So once you have 2 organisms or more in a common genus, everything up before that is going to be in common as well. And so then we want to get into okay, well, how do we actually specify certain species and differentiate them from others? Sometimes we have common or layman's terms for animals, but it's not very specific in terms of how we would refer to very specific species. For example, you might look at a vast variety of very specific types of bears, and you might just call them, that's a bear. But we could actually fine-tune that and refer to a very specific type of species, a very specific type of bear, if we tap into what's called binomial nomenclature. Again, I understand full well that we're probably not going to start referring to polar bears as Ursus maritimus, but it's important to understand how you might see these organisms referred to if we were to look at it officially in like a tree of life. So, this all started with Carolus Linnaeus. He's considered the father of taxonomy, and we have specified the naming structure. It's a two-name binomial, bi meaning two, nomial for name. It's a two-name naming system that always refers to the two most specific levels or taxa, and that's going to be a genus and a species. The genus is always going to be in italics and capitalized. The species is always going to be in italics and lowercase. And so I can see in my example here that I have three very unique species of bears. They all share the same genus, which is Ursus, right? So all of them would belong in that second most specific category together. They are all Ursus, and I could assume that this means that I'm talking about bears when I look at Ursus. And then to identify them uniquely as individual species, I would use that second name, which is the species name. So the American black bear is the Ursus americanus. The grizzly bear or the brown bear is Ursus arctos. And I can use that to refer specifically to certain species as opposed to others. And so this is how I get very, very specific. And now we're going to get to the bulk of what we're learning in Lesson 3, which is our phylogenetic trees, how we can actually use evolution to show the relationships between organisms. And so we can do that using a diagram we call a phylogenetic tree. And I have an example of one down here at the bottom. And these are used to predict evolutionary relationships among groups of organisms. Okay, and we're going to have so much practice actually working with these and building these out as a part of this lesson. For now, we're just going to want to understand what are the components to these trees. We don't have to get overly involved in the specifics. These are all just examples. And so it's important to understand that each time on this tree, each time I have a different branching point, so something breaking off or branching away from this, we could call this the trunk of the tree. That is referring to a new species coming into existence, or our word for that, which is speciation. So each of these branching points that you see here on this tree are referring to where a new species actually diverges. So I have one here, amphibians diverge, mammals diverge, turtles diverge. And all of these are diverging from an ultimate, here at the bottom, from a common ancestor that, if you looked back in time, all of these different types of organisms have in common right here. And so we have these hypotheses that are based on analyzing maybe their shared morphology, so how they look, their genetic codes, which we can map out and compare, or the way that these different organisms behave. And we're always going to want to shoot for maximum parsimony. And this is just saying we're always going to use the absolute simplest explanation for creating the tree as possible. So we're going to keep it as simple as we possibly can to simplify how we assess these relationships. So the big thing here is just understanding these are phylogenetic trees, and the branches show new species breaking off from an original common ancestor. So phylogenetic trees classify organisms into major groups. We call these groups taxa, and that comes from taxonomy, right, where we create those groups. And this is all based on evolutionary relationships. We classify groups of species in the order in which they descended, and in the order in which they descended from the same common ancestor. And we use homologous features or similar features of these organisms. Again, this could be any inherited trait. This could be their DNA code, the types of proteins they have in their bodies, their anatomical structures like wings or being two-legged or four-legged. And all of this is the result of what we called divergent evolution, where we have a whole lot of species branching off from a single common ancestor. And so you can see here, again, another example of this phylogenetic tree where this point right here represents the common ancestor. And as we go up, we see more specific categories, more specific branches that ultimately would have stemmed from this initial root at the bottom. And so phylogenetic trees can help us learn a lot of things if we can represent them. So phylogenetic trees can show us which groups are most closely related. They can show us which groups are least closely related, and which group ultimately within a phylogenetic tree diverged or speciated first. And so I can see that my very first branching point here, this is my first divergence. And so I've circled this in green, and the species or the group that actually diverged first, that actually has that first branch, if I follow that branch, is moss. And so moss would have been the group that diverged first. Second would have been the fern. And third, about the same time in terms of evolutionary history, were the pines and the roses. Now, which groups are most closely related? It's going to be the ones that are sharing the most branches, right? And so I can see that right here, I have 1, 2, 3 nodes in common between the pines and the roses. They are the closest to each other on my phylogenetic tree. And so that is saying that based on whatever criteria we use to branch these off, they share at least 1, 2, 3 of those things in common. Whereas if I was talking about the least closely related, I might say these are the ones that are most distant from each other on a tree. It's important to understand that this is going to be our rose and moss. It could also be our pine and moss. And this is based off of the fact that the moss only has one thing in common with either of these, right? So there are 2 steps that these groups took that the moss did not. And so we consider those to be distant from each other or least closely related. We want to break down how to read a phylogenetic tree, and then on our last slide, we're going to make sure that we understand how not to read a phylogenetic tree. So the way that I do this, and so this next 2 slides are extremely crucial, so we want to make sure that we really focus in on these 2. We've got the fact that we're going to always start from the root, okay? Just like with a real tree, we're going to always start growth from the root of that tree. And so at the bottom here in this orange, I've got a common ancestor for all A through F, all of these different species that have broken off. All of them share this one common ancestor. It's important to understand this common ancestor, we don't really have a name for it, right? We know where in terms of time, in terms of history, that this first branch broke off, but we do not know specifically what sort of a name would exist for this specific ancestor. It's just a point in time where we had speciation and divergence occur. As you move away from the root, essentially what you're doing is you're going from past to recent. So as I move up the tree, I'm moving forward in time. So I could say that E and F, these 2 species, diverged or came into existence, speciated, most recently, and this species, A, diverged the longest ago. And then we have another point that we want to understand, which is each one of these branching points, as we've already said, this is showing speciation or divergent evolution, where we have a branch of a family tree that is now going to become more specific. So each one of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, each one of those shows speciation occurring. If you were to follow a branch and then you have a horizontal line looking like it's almost cutting it off, that is referring to when a species becomes extinct, and so that branch will go no further, and so that's how we show that. And then it's also important to understand that each of these nodes represent a more common ancestor as you go up the tree. And so this is saying that this node in purple is common for a common ancestor for only C, D, E, and F, but it does not include A and B because, again, it occurred after the divergence of A and B. And that's how you read a phylogenetic tree. These are the things that it can tell us. Now, how not to read a phylogenetic tree, and this is also equally important. We don't want to think that these trees represent something that they don't. So they do not show that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right? This is not to say, so if you look here, this does not mean that bacteria evolved to become amoeba, which then evolved to become insects, which then evolved to become trouts. This is not what we're actually showing. What we're showing is just a passage of time and divergence points or species coming into existence, not from each other, but again, always from common ancestors. And as we see that we go further in time and further from each other, birds and bacteria are the least closely related because they share the least commonality in their ancestry, right? There's only one point that they have in common, and every step that I take closer to that shows more points in common. Also, they don't show that A is better than B or greater than C or greater than D. This is not to say that in this case, humans are greater or better than trout. Again, this isn't showing evolution in terms of every step is an improvement. This is showing a relative timeline of when these species came into existence. Okay, so remember, these are trees, not ladders. Birds and humans are not inherently better than bacteria just because they came about later. This means that within their environments, they are more fit and therefore speciated and diverged from common ancestors to have specific niches within their environment. Doesn't mean that they're inherently better than or worse than another species or group. And finally, we're going to have plenty of practice with these phylogenetic trees, how to read them and how to make them. And so there's a few questions that we can ask ourselves and we can practice with what these phylogenetic trees show and what they don't show. So for example, I'm going to have a few questions that are going to pop up as a part of this ed puzzle that you're doing, and we're going to see how well we've learned how to read one of these phylogenetic trees, and that is going to conclude our presentation. I'm going to have these questions pop up now, and once that last question goes, this presentation will be completed. And then we'll follow up with some more practice as we move forward in the lesson. I hope you found this helpful. I'm going to pause now so that we can answer those questions.